3.3 major project 7, keep on moving. This is video number 2, and this is to talk through the large scale torso pieces that I've been making. And at the moment I'm working with the Multimix Media, but also as well I think what is important is to still keep the idea and the concept of the fancy yarn and the knitting technique. Now I've got two prime examples here. One is pure yarn with a knitting technique, and then one will be a perfect example of probably a little bit more fun playing with the Multimix Media. Still continuing with the colour palette of the grey and red. I think also as well with the creative yarns, it allows you to kind of bend the rules a little bit with your colour palette and slightly introduce another tone of colour. So for example, with this piece here I've used pom-pom yarn rather than go for anything that was kind of too grey or too charcoal grey. I think it would have muted and lost the eye for the detail and the colour and the tactility. So I think at some point the knitwear has to be broken up. I've still gone through with the concept of using elements of the stripe. Most of the time the stripe is a red stripe for the line for dyslexia. The tuck stitch is quite important with the whole of the collection because I think it's giving a good strong idea of technique. It might be a simple technique, but the process takes quite a long time, especially on something that is large scale. But also as well, it's allowing me with threads as well as the Multimix Media to be able to hook in and knitting so that it makes the actual fabric piece strong and also durable. It's been interesting to go from smaller scale samples moving up into larger scale samples. The 4 torso pieces have probably on average, because they are longer, they are wider, because I have to consider how the knit reacts through the making, that sometimes you lose some of the scale, so you kind of have to add on to give you that little bit more manoeuvrability for the making for the final pieces. But I think I've been quite surprised at how long the simple idea actually takes to make. There's lots of counting, lots of row counting, lots of counting of needles, hooking up, making sure it's secure, making sure that it's not going to fall off the knitting bed. So there's quite a lot to take on board, and I think it's also giving me a taste of the industrial concepts of how difficult it is when it comes to making a fabric, through the aesthetic design of the fabric, and how you are actually going to make it. So all in all, the processes are quite intense. It's quite, I would say the knitting has an element of meditation to it, which I have kind of already researched. It's quite calming, it's quite therapeutic to make, apart from when something goes wrong with the knitting machine and it decides to become temperamental, or stitches drop off, or sometimes when you lose that thought process, the thing drops off. So there's quite a lot to take on board, but also as well what I have really enjoyed from this learning process is how I'm thinking ahead of how I'm actually going to make something, and making the documentation of how many stitches and how many rows and how wide I'm making something and how long I'm making something. And I think that there is a prime example of the dyslexia trait of how to problem solve, because I would say I find it very difficult to read a pattern to make that pattern translate into a form of knitting. If I have researched any knitting techniques, I have done it visually. I've gone onto YouTube, or I'll use the visual imagery in a knitting manual. So it's just my way of learning of how to carry out and execute the skill of using the techniques on the knitting machine. So back to the sample. This piece again is flexible. It's particularly soft. It does stretch. Again, once it was taken off the machine, it felt very scarf-like. I think one thing that I am really enjoying about my work at the moment is the front and the back are just as interesting as each other, but obviously here we can see that I've been working with the back because that's where the making of it is. I've still taken on board and put variations of finishing edges. I took on board my tutor feedback from 3.2 that finishing edges are just as important with the way that they are made, but also as well I think the scale. And I think the playing with the scales of red in these projects is just quite important because it is the colour for dyslexia. And I think also as well it just makes all the pieces feel different. And I do quite like a big rib on the bottom of a jumper or a garment or objects of some description. So once you actually take the piece off the knitting machine, that is only when you get to see the pieces of how they work and the way that they manipulate. It's quite interesting really to actually see this process of something that just starts off as a small row and then 2 to 3 hours later, through hooking up and casting on, casting off, changing the colour, you actually see something just lengthen and actually start to become a final product. So this piece in particular does have a halfway demarcation line which is going to sit on the top of the shoulder. This will actually allow me to possibly, as of yet undecided within the making, I may use the front and bring that into the concept of the armoured piece. Again, this is where I will be making documentation and note making once they fit onto my friend here. But the main point of the beginning of Project 7 was to actually get the fabrics in order and use the technique and the mixed media that I'd made decisions on in the interrogation boards. Now, I did want to put a piece together. Earlier on in one of my projects, I'd used a lot of various shapes and so forth. I'd made a large scale sample of various sort of square techniques and so forth, and made the crinoline skirt and the chunky arm. Some of these ideas are going to filter through, but I wanted to make one piece in particular because this is answering the question really of durable mixed media. It's electrical plastic cable protectors and foam fishing weights. So as put together, each line has a different amount of fixtures and fittings attached to it. That was fun to make, and I think it's just something that was just nice because I think this will look great when it goes through the performance of either dance or you know, just using it and attaching it to the body as a platform. So again, I've used the same sort of concept where it will be a torso shaped. I may, you know, through developments again, distort it and rearrange it around the body. This is quite light. It is actually the Aran yarn that makes it quite durable, but it's been quite interesting that the deeper that you go with your stripes and you start to hook up these areas, actually makes the knit rather textured. again, we can see through here how we have quite strong three-dimensional red lines. These, through the duration of the making, actually respond to the research that I have done with the raised line of the paper in dyslexia education, where the dyslexic candidate has to write within the chunky lines of the raised paper. So there we can actually see a reflection of that research, and then through here we can obviously see the reflection of the research with durable mixed media making the connections with chainmail armour. And also as well, I'd probably say to you that once you start playing around with this, it almost feels fidget-like, because of the colour and the tactility makes you want to touch it. So it's kind of resonating as well with the ideas of the calming effects that the fidget has within dyslexia education. So I think even though I've gone through the ideas of the interrogation boards, I think the interrogation board hasn't prevented me from bringing on board all the knowledge and the learning that I've been doing with this theme of dyslexia, with the themes of armour, with the theme of the red colour, because I think the red also highlights how important it is. But also as well, I think it's that thing of actually bringing textiles and making it a fashion concept that will speak volumes to the idea of the thin red line for dyslexia. Thinking about exhibitions and titles for an exhibition, I've been playing with the idea of the armour red line for dyslexia. Through a percentage of my blog pages, I've always tried to add in a title that kind of reflects the work. So at the moment, that's going to be an ongoing process of thinking of a good, strong title that will actually evaluate the collection, and also as well to actually see the collection at some point in performance.